The story begins in the heart of a bustling city within the walls of Lexington Goldstein LLP, a law firm known for representing high-profile clients. The camera pans across the reception area, adorned with marble floors and sparkling chandeliers, before settling on the grand office of Edward Kensington, one of the firm's most celebrated attorneys. Edward's office was a shrine to his achievements. Polished mahogany bookshelves lined with thick legal volumes, awards mounted on the walls, and a corner desk stacked with neatly organized case files. A gold nameplate gleamed on his desk. Edward Kensington, senior partner. Behind him, a massive window offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, symbolizing his lofty position in the legal world. Edward himself sat in a high-backed leather chair, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit. His sharp, clean-shaven face exuded confidence, though his cold gray eyes betrayed a hint of arrogance. He leaned back, scrolling through emails on his tablet, barely glancing at the assistant who announced his next appointment. "Your 3 p.m. is here, sir." "A Mr. Johnson," she said with professional politeness. Edward sighed, his irritation barely concealed. "Fine, send him in, but make it quick. I've got a lunch reservation at the club." Moments later, the door creaked open, and Marcus Johnson stepped in. Marcus was a middle-aged black man, dressed in a modest but well-pressed suit. He clutched a worn leather briefcase tightly, his eyes scanning the intimidating room as he approached Edward's desk. His nervousness was palpable, but so was his determination. "Good afternoon, Mr. Kensington," Marcus began, extending his hand. His voice was steady but carried a hint of apprehension. Edward glanced at Marcus's hand but made no move to shake it. Instead, he gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Take a seat," he said curtly. His tone clipped. Marcus sat down cautiously, placing his briefcase on his lap. He opened it to retrieve a set of documents, speaking as he did. "Thank you for seeing me. I've heard great things about your work, and I believe you're the best person to help me with my case." Edward smirked faintly, leaning forward as he examined Marcus more closely. His gaze lingered just a moment too long, as if silently assessing Marcus's worth. "Mr. Johnson, I'm a very busy man," Edward began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I only take cases that are challenging and worth my time. What exactly is it that you're dealing with?" Marcus hesitated but pressed on. "It's a property dispute, sir. My family's home, it's been in our name for generations, but now the developer is trying to claim ownership through a loophole. I have all the documents to prove our right to the property." He held out the papers, his hand trembling slightly. Edward didn't take them. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms. "A property dispute?" he repeated, his tone laced with disinterest. "This sounds like a routine matter. Surely there are other lawyers who can handle something so mundane." Marcus's brow furrowed. "But, sir, this is more than just a property dispute. This developer has a history of targeting minority communities, pushing people out of their homes to build luxury condos. It's about standing up to injustice." Edward's lips curled into a dismissive smile. "Injustice, Mr. Johnson. The legal system doesn't care about your emotional grievances. It cares about facts and strategy. And frankly, I don't see how this case is worth my firm's resources." Marcus's face fell, but he tried once more. "I can pay your fee," he said, his voice almost pleading. "I just need someone who can—" Edward held up a hand, cutting him off. "It's not about the fee, it's about priorities. My clients include multinational corporations and billion-dollar estates. I'm afraid your case doesn't fit my profile." The words hit Marcus like a slap. He sat frozen for a moment, then nodded stiffly, gathering his documents. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Kensington," he said quietly. Standing up, Edward didn't reply. He simply returned to his tablet, already moving on to the next matter. As Marcus walked out of the office, his shoulders were slumped, but his grip on the briefcase was firm. Beneath the humiliation burned a quiet determination. He would not give up, not yet. Marcus walked down the busy city streets, clutching his briefcase as he replayed Edward's dismissive words in his mind. Each rejection he'd faced so far had stung, but this one felt particularly cruel. He couldn't shake the image of Edward's smirk, the condescension in his tone, determined to keep trying. Marcus visited several other law firms over the next few days. Each time he received the same response: polite refusals or outright dismissals. Some lawyers claimed they were too busy, while others hinted, in ways they thought subtle, that his case wasn't significant enough. Marcus couldn't ignore the underlying prejudice in their reactions. One day, after yet another rejection, Marcus sat on a bench in the city park, his head in his hands. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his daughter, a college student, asking how things were going. Her words reminded him why he was fighting. This wasn't just about a house. It was about preserving his family's legacy and ensuring a safe home for future generations. As he looked around, his eyes landed on an older man, seated a few benches away. The man was reading a thick legal tome, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. Something about him seemed approachable, yet authoritative. Summoning his courage, Marcus walked over. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said hesitantly. "I couldn't help but notice you're reading about law. Are you an attorney?" The man looked up, his weathered face breaking into a kind smile. "Retired," he replied, closing the book. "Name's William Hargrove. What can I do for you?" Marcus explained his situation, detailing the property dispute and the difficulties he'd faced in finding representation. Hargrove listened intently, nodding occasionally. When Marcus finished, Hargrove leaned forward. "You've got a tough road ahead, son," Hargrove said, "but it sounds like you have a strong case. Have you considered representing yourself?" Marcus blinked in surprise. "Represent myself? I'm not a lawyer." "No, but you're a man who believes in his cause," Hargrove said firmly, "and sometimes that's half the battle. If you're willing to put in the work, I can help guide you." Hargrove became Marcus's mentor, meeting him daily to review legal procedures and strategies. They spent hours poring over case law, crafting arguments, and preparing evidence. Marcus transformed his dining table into a makeshift war room, papers and sticky notes covering every inch. His daughter joined the effort, helping him organize files and practice his speeches. One evening, as they rehearsed, she hugged him tightly. "You're going to win, Dad," she said. "I know it." Late nights turned into early mornings, but Marcus's determination never wavered. Hargrove often reminded him, "Stay focused on the facts. Let your conviction do the rest." The day before the court date, Marcus stood in front of a mirror, practicing his opening statement one last time. His reflection showed a man who'd faced countless barriers but refused to back down. He was ready. The courthouse was abuzz with activity as people streamed into the courtroom, filling every available seat. Lawyers, journalists, and curious onlookers whispered among themselves, their excitement growing with every passing minute. Edward Kensington's reputation had drawn a crowd. He was known as a legal powerhouse who rarely lost a case. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of spectators leaning forward, eager to catch every word. At the front of the room, Edward stood confidently beside his client, a smug expression on his face. To him, this was just another routine victory waiting to happen. Then, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. All eyes turned as Marcus Johnson stepped in, his worn briefcase in hand. His heart pounded, but he walked with a quiet determination that belied his nerves. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people recognized him. Was this the man daring to challenge Kensington? Edward's confident smirk faltered for a split second as he glanced at Marcus. Recovering quickly, he leaned toward his client and muttered something under his breath, dismissing Marcus as a minor inconvenience. The judge entered, calling the court to order. As everyone rose and then settled into their seats, Marcus took his place at the plaintiff's table. He could feel the skeptical eyes of the jury and the spectators boring into him. Even the judge's initial glance carried a hint of doubt. Edward's opening statement was delivered with his usual flair, weaving a narrative that painted his client as the rightful owner of the disputed property. His voice was smooth, his arguments precise, and his demeanor commanding. The jury nodded along, clearly impressed. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath. He stood, adjusting his tie with trembling fingers, and began. His voice was steady, but lacked the polish of a seasoned lawyer. Yet, as he spoke, something shifted. His sincerity was palpable, his words carrying the weight of personal conviction. The jury leaned forward, their initial skepticism beginning to waver. Edward watched with a growing sense of irritation, his confidence chipping away with each passing moment. The underdog was proving to be more formidable than he had anticipated. Edward strode to the center of the courtroom with the air of a seasoned performer taking the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice ringing with authority, "today we are here to protect the sanctity of property rights and ensure that due process is upheld." He outlined his case with practiced ease, peppering his statements with legal jargon and rhetorical flourishes designed to dazzle the jury. Edward painted his client as a victim of opportunism and dismissed Marcus's claims as baseless and emotional so. Marcus sat quietly, his hands folded on the table, his expression calm. When his turn came, he rose, his movements deliberate. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice steady but not theatrical. "This case is not just about property. It is about a family's legacy and the rights of a community that has been systematically overlooked." The jury's initial skepticism began to wane as Marcus laid out his arguments. He cited historical documents, referenced precedents, and tied his points back to the broader issue of systemic injustice. His sincerity and grounded approach stood in stark contrast to Edward's polished but impersonal delivery. As the trial progressed, Marcus began presenting his evidence. He introduced photographs of the property, dated deeds bearing his family's name, and records of tax payments spanning decades. Each piece of evidence was meticulously prepared, and with every presentation, Edward's confidence began to waver. The turning point came when Marcus called an unexpected witness, a former employee of the developer, who testified about unethical practices and deliberate targeting of minority-owned properties. The testimony was damning, and Edward's attempts to discredit the witness only highlighted his frustration. Edward resorted to underhanded tactics, interrupting Marcus with objections and attempting to confuse the jury with convoluted counter-arguments. But Marcus, guided by his preparation and Hargrove's advice, remained calm and focused. "The facts speak for themselves," he reminded the jury, "and justice demands that we listen." The courtroom grew silent as Marcus delivered his closing argument. His voice, though weary from days of trial, carried the weight of conviction. "This case is not just about my family," he said, his eyes meeting each juror's. "It is about standing up to those who think they can rewrite history with money and influence. It is about ensuring that justice is not a privilege, but a right." By the time he finished, even the spectators seemed moved. Edward's rebuttal, though sharp, lacked the emotional resonance of Marcus's plea. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. The foreperson stood, her voice clear and unwavering. "We find in favor of the plaintiff." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Edward's face turned pale, his composed exterior cracking under the weight of the loss. Marcus, meanwhile, sat motionless for a moment, the verdict sinking in. Then he turned to his daughter, who was sitting in the gallery, and smiled. The spectators erupted into applause, and Marcus stood to shake hands with Hargrove, who had been watching quietly from the back of the room. Justice had prevailed, and for the first time in weeks, Marcus felt the heavy burden on his shoulders begin to lift. As Edward gathered his papers in silence, the lesson was clear. Arrogance and prejudice had no place in the pursuit of justice. Edward Kensington sat in his grand office, but for the first time it felt smaller, almost suffocating. The verdict had sent shockwaves through the legal community, and his once unassailable reputation had taken a serious hit. The whispers in the hallways of Lexington Goldstein LLP were impossible to ignore. Partners who once sang his praises now exchanged wary glances when he walked by Dot. He stared at the framed awards on his wall, the symbols of his success, but they felt hollow now. Edward clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. How had this happened? He had underestimated Marcus Johnson, dismissed him as insignificant, and now he was paying the price. Dot, the phone on his desk, buzzed, and his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Kensington, the firm's board would like to see you tomorrow morning." Edward sighed, leaning back in his chair. He knew what was coming. His arrogance had cost the firm not just the case, but their credibility. Regret mingled with his frustration, but he couldn't bring himself to admit his own shortcomings. Instead, he muttered bitterly, "It was just one case." Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson stood outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters gathered around him. His daughter clung to his arm, tears of joy streaming down her face. For Marcus, the verdict was more than just a legal win. It was a triumph over the systemic prejudice he had faced his entire life. He addressed the reporters with humility and gratitude. "This isn't just about my family's home. It's about standing up for what's right. It's about showing that justice can prevail even when the odds are stacked against you." The crowd erupted into applause as Marcus turned to embrace his daughter. "We did it," he whispered. "This is for your future." Later that evening, Marcus and his daughter sat at their dining table, now cleared of legal papers. Hargrove joined them for dinner, smiling as he watched the family celebrate. "You earned this, Marcus," he said. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't fight back." The story of Marcus Johnson and Edward Kensington is a reminder of the enduring power of perseverance and the fallacy of underestimating others based on prejudice. Edward's arrogance led to his downfall, while Marcus's determination and belief in justice carried him to victory. That in the end, the case wasn't just about property or legal arguments. It was about challenging the status quo and proving that even the most entrenched systems of power can be held accountable. Justice is not a privilege reserved for the wealthy and powerful. It is a right that belongs